In this video, we're going to learn UV mapping in Blender for Second Life. Before we begin, let's understand the difference between object and edit mode as it pertains to objects. While in object mode, any object in this 3D space is going to be separate from the other. In this case, we have one cube. If I press Shift D to duplicate and then move it, I'm going to press X to restrict on the X-axis, and then I just left click to place it. Now we have two independent cubes, right? You can select each one and they're independent from the other. In this case, if you were to upload this to Second Life, it would be a link set where you would have one root and one child. So these are separate objects, but they become a link set when you upload them to Second Life. Let's go into edit mode and see what the difference is. Select the box tab to go into edit mode. Select the whole thing. I'm going to do a Shift D again to duplicate. I'm going to press X to restrict it on the X axis. I'm going to left click to place it. And again, we have two cubes, but they're all one object. And we know that by tabbing back into object mode and seeing that this is all one object. Even though there are two cubes, they're all one object. So keep in mind, in object mode, when you add or import mesh, it is going to be separate from the other objects that are in object mode at the time. When you go into edit mode, you can then add or import objects and they will become a part of the whole. So the other thing I wanted to show you is that you can part a particular object to separate it. So I can select this cube, press P to part, and do selection, and it will part it so that I can go back into object mode and they are now separate. Likewise, I can select two by holding Shift and pressing Control J, and they will join. When I go into edit mode, they are joined as one object. Let me go back and show you something. There we go. Now they're separate. I have to go into edit mode independently. But I can select both of them by holding Shift and then go into edit mode and edit them as well, as you see here. So all of these things need to be considered when working with Blender. In object mode, each thing you add becomes a separate object. In edit mode, each thing you add adds to an object that then when you tab back into object mode will show as one whole object. The other thing to consider is that every time you change the size of something, let's say I scale this up, I just pressed S and scaled it. If I scale an object or I rotate it with R, then that object has to be updated before you can import it into Second Life. Because if you don't, then the size and the rotation are going to be off and they won't match the visual representation in size that you see here. So keep that in mind, that every time you make a change in object mode, whether it be scale or rotation, you have to apply those scales and rotation changes by going into object, apply, rotation and scale, or individually. Or you can do all transforms and it'll do them all. There are going to be times where you'll run into a situation where the object size doesn't match the actual size that it is, or you're trying to use the grid and it doesn't match up. These are indicators that you need to apply object rotation and scale to fix the issue. Let's get started with UV mapping. First, what is UV mapping? UV mapping is the process of unwrapping a 3D object or unfolding it into a 2D representation so that it can be used as a texture map for texturing the 3D object. It used to be that in Blender, whenever you added an object, you had to unwrap it manually. And you did that by going into edit mode and then going into edge select and then selecting edges and then marking seams so that Blender could figure out how to best unwrap the object. And you still have to do that for more complex shapes. But they added in the feature that all of the default shapes have their own unwraps already. And so if we take this cube and we go into UV editing view, and if we're in edit mode and we select the cube, we can see that it is unwrapped. And this is typically what the unwrap would look like if you had set the seams manually. So you're getting the added benefit of having the shapes already unwrapped for you, where before you didn't have that in Blender. You had to do it with each shape individually, and you still do with more complex shapes. It's just that you get a good head start with the default objects already having unwraps. If we drop a torus here and then we move it on the x-axis so we can see it, if we go into UV editing, we can see that it is already unwrapped here. So that is an added benefit that wasn't always there in the old Blender. But the thing to keep in mind is the fact that as you start adding geometry and modifying the basic shapes from this menu, the geometry will change and some geometry will not show up on the texture map appropriately. So the first thing we're going to do is go into face select and select this particular face. And I'm going to inset it with I, and then I'm going to look at the texture map first. Notice that everything matches perfectly. Everything's fine. It all shows up like it should be. But watch what happens when I extrude. If I take this face and I extrude it in, it's not showing these inner faces here. As you can see, they're represented as lines because they are perpendicular to the texture map. So we have to fix them. There are multiple ways to fix the problem. The first way is to tell Blender to unwrap the object. To do that, we select the object and then use the menu option Unwrap. But what's going to happen is it's going to fail. Notice that it's asking us to set edge seams so that it can tell how to unwrap the object. And this is the same thing that I was talking about earlier pertaining to how we used to have to manually set edge seams on objects to be able to unwrap them properly. And so now we have a situation where we have added geometry that can't be unwrapped easily by Blender without telling it or giving it a nudge by setting edge seams. Now we could go back into modeling and we could select certain edges and then mark them as seams to try to get it to unwrap correctly. But that may not work. We might have to go through a whole series of tries before we find out what works. And as you gain more experience, you learn more how to do this and to get the results that you need. But right now, we don't have to do all this, thankfully. Let's go back and I'll show you how to fix it. So we'll go back into UV editing, and all we have to do is select the whole object and then use the Smart UV Project. And it's going to unwrap it again, but this time the faces that we needed, that were missing, or at least not represented correctly, are now showing properly. And if we look at the whole object, the faces that we had added here all are in proportion to the rest of the object. So the texture is going to be correct proportionally. So now that we have all of this and everything is fixed, we have our map. we're ready to go for texturing. Something that I forgot to add that I'm throwing in here right now is that we need to separate our islands with spacing. The reason we do that is so we don't have overlap. Also, there's another issue with the way Second Life reduces textures that may cause certain edges to have 1 or 2 pixels of transparency when you know for a fact that it was baked properly into the texture. It's just the fact that in the reduction process, um, the edge, like maybe this one right here, doesn't quite come to the end where it's supposed to. And so you have transparency on an edge that shouldn't be there. The fix for that is twofold. Again, for no overlap, you need to do some spacing, and we do that by just doing another UV project, but this time adding in an island margin, which I use 0.06 typically. This gives us spacing. This, I believe, equals 6 pixels. Once we do that, the other setting we need to set is in the render properties. We need to go down to the very bottom underneath bake and find margin. We need to set it to something like 6 pixels, and that will allow us to over bake beyond the boundaries of the islands 6 pixels. In doing so, we eliminate the transparency problem, and we also eliminate the overlap that would occur if the islands are next to each other. Something that I just remembered that I forgot to mention is the fact that I didn't explain that I had switched the render engine from Eevee to Cycles in preparation for doing the texture baking, because Eevee doesn't have the capability of baking textures. And so you have to switch to Cycles and then go down to the bottom and set the margin. So just keep that in mind. Switching back to Eevee for a second, let's go over to shading. And we will turn on ambient occlusion once we get in close here. Okay, you see how it's adding shading there? It's not really too noticeable, but let's kick it up a little bit. Notice that it's getting darker. So it's adding in shading, and it might look pixelated or grainy right now, but that can be adjusted. But anyway, what I wanted to point out is the fact that ambient occlusion adds shading to various crevices and things like that. And so we also have ambient occlusion with cycles. If we switch to cycles and we scroll down to the bottom where light pass is, we go down and we find fast GI approximation. That is AO for cycles. Watch what happens when I switch to render. Notice that it's very dark in there. Watch what happens when I turn it off. It gets lighter. So that's the AO for cycles, and it only shows once you're rendering and not from the viewport itself. So keep that in mind. I've turned it on, and I'm going to leave it on for the bake. If we go down to bake, make sure that we're set for combined, because combined is going to combine AO or ambient occlusion with the texture itself. So let's get to the texture. To do the texture, we need to add an image texture node right here, and we need to connect the color to the base color of the shader. Notice that it's putting out black right now because there's nothing outputting from this particular node yet. We need to open a texture that's going to be our input texture for the bake. In this case, I'm going to select a seamless texture with wood. So now we have wood pumping into the object and displaying. So next we need to have an output texture. To do that, we add a second image texture, and then we create new. We can call this one box texture. Make sure you turn off alpha because you're not going to need it in this case. You don't want the the texture to be transparent. Now we should be set for baking. Let's make sure we have everything set right. We have our ambient occlusion on, we have our combined baking type, we had already set margins, and I want to make sure this is set for GPU because that makes the graphics card do the processing instead of the CPU or the main processor. Okay, so once that's all set and I've got my textures set, I should be able to bake and it should happen. Let's try it. There it goes. Now it's going to display the result over here, or it should. Okay, so here it is. Notice that it has the shading that we see when we go into render. Let's go back. Notice also that we can take this and unplug it now as the input, and we can drop this one in there, and it renders exactly, or actually it displays actually as it was rendered with the texture. So now we can take this texture and save it. And how we do that is image, save as. We can call it box texture. I'm just going to throw it, let's throw it in this directory here. And that's all we need as far as texturing goes. We've got our texture. Our object is ready to go. All we have to do is export it as a DAE file, and we'll just leave it as UV map example, but we're going to send it to the D drive. Okay, we should be able to bring it into Second Life. Let's try. Going to upload the image first, which is going to be on the D drive. There it is. Okay, so that's in there. Then I'm going to upload the model, which is this right here. And we need to look at it, make sure everything looks okay. I'm pushing in and out on the mouse while I'm holding the left mouse button. If I press down Control, I can rotate like this. If I release Control, it goes back. If I press Control Shift, I can pan. Oops, let me get it to work here. Yeah, it's panning forward and backward, left, right, up and down. But it won't let you go left and right because the window is so small. So let me move this like this. And it still won't, it's still constraining. Anyway, you get the idea. So we do our settings, we can see what the medium and the low looks like, and the lowest, which they look like crap, but we can fix that. Just change this, and that shouldn't affect our actual prim count whatsoever because it's so low. So I'm going to call this UV map test, and I'm going to calculate, and it's still under 1 prim, so we can upload it and be happy. Now you might have noticed that I did set the physics to lowest, so I'm going to drop it out on the ground, and I am going to edit it and make sure this is white because I don't want it to be off-white. And I'm going to go into textures and scroll down to my box texture, which is right here. Notice that it displays exactly as expected. And you might notice, I don't know if I explained this before, but because the light source, which is the lamp, this thing here, is on the back corner, you're getting much greater light on the right side here than you would on the left. And that shows up in the in the texture here, as you can see. So that is if you do it with all one texture map. And again, let's look at that texture map just to have a gander at it. So that's what the texture map looks like. Now let's go back and let's create a new one, but this time we're going to do it with individual faces instead of doing a texture map like this. This will also serve as a speed run through this particular video because you'll get to see how I do it quicker without having to stop and explain everything. So now it's made. All we have to do is go into our UV editor and decide how we want to divvy up the faces. Now remember, by default we only have one material, so we have to create other materials to set our faces. So I'm going to set all these outer ones as one face. And to do that, I am going to create another material, and that material I'm going to call outer faces. I'm going to press enter and then assign. Make sure you don't forget to assign, because otherwise it won't apply those particular selected faces to that material. Once we do that, we're going to set another material for this. We're going to call this one outer front and press enter, assign. Then we're going to do the inner faces, and those are going to be yet another. In fact, because we only have those left, we can go ahead and just rename this material, because if we deselect this and select it again, you can see that it's already selecting the remainder of what I haven't assigned yet. Just to go a step further, let's take this one out of the equation and just make it this circle here. So make another material, and we'll call this one, I'll call it roundabout for lack of a better term. Assign. Now the last one is material, so we're going to just rename that one back. Boom. So now everything has been assigned. Now we have to start unwrapping everything, because if you look, the back, for instance, is not unwrapped very good. It needs to take up the whole texture. So let's do the back first, since it's the one that's selected. I'll select it, go to UV. I can do a simple unwrap because it's just a square. It should unwrap just fine. Next, we're going to deselect that one, go down and select this one, and this is the outer. Now we could leave this like it is, but it's not going to look very good. Instead, rather than unwrap this all at once like this or keep it like this, I'm going to do individual unwraps for each particular face on the object, and that's going to give me a uniform texture on each one of these. I'll explain that here in a second. Okay, I think I got them all. I did. So now they are all unwrapped, each one individually, to take up the whole texture space. And because they're all one material, this is all going to be still one face. Notice when I select it, it's selecting all of them at once. So yes, this has one face assignment, but when I set the texture, because of the mapping, it's going to map them each out like that. And so they will each take on the full texture like that. And you'll see that when we get into Second Life. Okay, so the back's set, and so is the outer. Now we need to switch to the next one. Select it. This one needs to be unwrapped, and we can do a simple unwrap and it'll come out just fine. Then these are all that's left. So I'm going to select these, and we need to unwrap them. Now I could unwrap like this. That's not good. We need to do a smart unwrap, and it would look like this. Now if you're okay with that, where it only takes a quarter of the texture, you can do that, or you can do the same thing we did with the outer and just unwrap each one individually so that they take on the texture. Now that one didn't show up right. Okay, I see what's happening. We can move these out, no problem. So let's unwrap these first. Okay, unwrap this last one. Now what we need to do is make sure that we go under here and set constrain to image bounds so that we don't go beyond the bounds of the image when we move it. So this one's selected. Let's do it first. G, Y, and just move it up until it stops. And left click. Select the next one. GY, move it up. Select the next one. This is going to be X. GX, move it over. Next one, GX, and move it over. And that's it. It's all fixed. Now, you might notice that the rotations are going to be different for each one of these. And depending on how you want these to be displayed, you could rotate them here by selecting the whole thing and then hitting R and rotating 90 degrees, something like that. That would fix it. Or you could just fix it in Second Life. Now, if you do that in Second Life, because they're all one face, remember, it's going to rotate them all at the same time. So in that case, because they're all the same face, you're going to have to fix it here if you need to. So, the same thing with the outer, too. If you don't like the rotations, go in and fix them. So this is probably where you want to save your blend first. This is going to be individual faces for Second Life. Example. And we will save it on D. And since we're not doing textures, we're done. All we got to do is export it. And we'll set that on D as well, which it is. Then we just go into Second Life, import, make sure it looks good. We can generate these, or I mean set them for LOD. Then we go and set this for lowest because we don't care about physics. Then we set this to individual example. And we go into calculate. And it's good, so we just upload. Now we just drop this to the ground. And we need to first change the color to white. Then we can select individual faces and then set textures. So I go set this for beach. That's going to set all of those, as you see. Now this one, these two faces would need rotated. So we would need to figure out what those two faces are in Blender and then just rotate them 90 degrees. So if I go back to Blender and I select this face, I can just simply select all this and rotate on the X 90 degrees. Select this one, do the same thing, rotate X 90. Now let's see what happens when we export it. Call this number 2, and we will bring that into Second Life. This is going to be our third example. We'll go ahead and call it individual 2. Generate to LOD, physics none, or lowest I mean. Calculate, upload. Now it should be rotated if I did it right. I might have used the wrong axis. We'll see. So we'll change the color to white. We will select this guy here, and it did rotate. So that's how I fixed that. And you can do the same thing with the inside, like this bottom one is rotated different than the others. Okay, so let's try this out again. Let's change the textures on the back. We'll make this ebony maybe, and these ebony. And then the outer we might set for pine. And so that's how you do a face assignment for your object that you're going to bring into Second Life, as opposed to using a texture map. So hopefully that gives you something to think about, and I guess I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.